Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's jump right into it. October 9, 2000 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, WCW Sale Rumors, The Rock and Scorpion King, more. By Dave Meltzer. Months into the story of the future of ECW and WCW, situations remain largely up in the air. WCW has not made any abrupt changes in management, structure or direction, despite huge losses and internal turmoil and rumors of sales being imminent. At press time, there was substantial internal belief, which is largely a combination of trying to piece together rumors, that the company sale would either be announced just after press time this week, or on October 23rd at a private meeting with the wrestlers in Little Rock, Arkansas at the first major TV taping after the Australia tour. Most information seemed the announcement would be made this week, but the question at deadline time was which of two deals would Turner Broadcasting take. According to sources close to the situation, the scenario some say it most likely would involve Eric Bischoff back in charge with funding from Mandalay-based sports and entertainment, and perhaps outside funding from other major companies as part of the package. Reports were that if the deal went through that Vince Russo would be gone. Russo was said to be behaving as if he was aware of that at the production meeting before Nitro this week, and many found it curious that Russo is not going to Australia, where several TV tapings will be taking place, although those close to him say he never planned to go there in the first place. There is also talk that the Australian television shows will be more wrestling-oriented. Hulk Hogan, who has been quiet for some time, called up Bubba the Love Sponge on October 3rd and said he woke up to 17 phone messages telling him the Mandalay deal was done and intimated that was the end of Russo, but those close to Hogan say both he and Ric Flair, who have been in contact of late, are close with either side that would wind up with power. Hogan was laughing about how many of the younger wrestlers are now saying how they never had a problem with Hogan and how the situation looks to be turning out. Internal sources have also indicated that if the deal goes through with Bischoff, that it is expected Randy Savage would also be brought back. Even though WCW was in a cost-cutting mode, apparently the reason no contract releases were given to high-priced talent they weren't using is because the prospective buyers didn't want to have any major talent under contract switch over to the WWF before the sale went through. For whatever this is worth, the Mandalay Corporation took out the domain name of WCWextreme.com as well as Quickstream.com. They actually took them out back in the summer of 1999, so that isn't the evidence necessarily of an imminent sale, but appears to be evidence of long-time interest in acquiring the company dating back to last summer, as well as possibly creating a new name while keeping the WCW brand. Electronic media on October 2nd in a cover story reported that Mandalay Sports Entertainment run by Peter Guber is in serious negotiations to buy WCW, and that insiders expect a deal by mid-October. The story quoted Jason Hervey, who would be expected to be, along with Bischoff and possibly Todd Guber, Peter's nephew, the key power brokers in the company should the sale go through, as not committing as far as the deal itself goes. It is believed the principals have confidentiality clauses until the public announcement is made, but certainly made broad comments indicating such a thing, talking about creating an independent company looking into long-term asset creation with branded series programming. We really believe in long-term asset creation and look at it as part of the merchandising, international format rights and other licensing and sales opportunities that are out there. We are basically leveraging out belief that sports and entertainment media is going to continue to intersect and we want to be a player in that field. Mandalay Sports Entertainment owns a few sports franchises, the highest profile being the minor league baseball Las Vegas Stars. Several WCW employees went to Human Resources on October 3rd and were told that if something were to happen regarding Turner no longer owning the company, for every week they have been with the company, they will get the equivalent of 2 weeks of severance pay. At press time, several were preparing to go to Australia with no idea if they would have jobs when they returned. On the ECW front, meetings were scheduled for later this week between ECW and TNN to work out terms of their relationship, or of ending the relationship. Both sides had agreed to 2 additional shows, an agreement which ends with the October 6th show. WWF has agreed to waive its exclusivity through the end of the year and TNN is willing, if the sides come to terms, to keep ECW through that period. ECW is believed to be willing to stay, provided they are given the right to leave before the end of the year provided they make an outside deal. Although all the wrestlers remain 1 month behind in pay, nobody has yet to file a breach of contract in writing to the company. At press time, ECW had not yet signed a deal with the USA Network, but most reports indicate negotiations have remained strong. 3 stars. The World Wrestling Federation on September 27 announced a revised estimates of profit for the current fiscal year, stating profits would be lower than originally anticipated, leading to stock plummeting in after-hours trading from $19.75 to $12.75. The price steadied later in the week after the McMahon family announced it was making a stock buyback which could have been as much as $10 million to prop the price back up and stop the decline, and the price stood at $15 per share at press time, down 24% for the week. According to a company press release, there is expected to be an 8 to 10% drop in pre-tax profits and an overall 3% drop in after-tax profits due to increases in the live event business not being enough to make up for disappointing figures in licensing. The release stated that costs for the XFL remain in line with previous projections. With the company in line for projected profits in the vicinity of $80 million, the drop would still mean the company would still be hugely profitable, perhaps in the $72 million to $74 million range for the year, although those numbers may be slightly off. Vince McMahon on October 2nd said that it is conceivable they could reach the earlier projections of profitability, just that the way the numbers look today it appears they won't. He pointed out that the return of Steve Austin should boost business over the original budget projections in both attendance and merchandise, noting in specific that the WWF expects more than 600,000 buys for its Unforgiven pay-per-view on September 24th, which was budgeted originally for 400,000 buys. Blamed for the disappointing licensing results were sales of the last round of Yak's Pacific Toys being well below projections, as was licensing venues stemming from a partnership with NHRA Racing. Vince McMahon said the company needed to do a better job of managing its licensing division and noted that Jim Bell, who had headed licensing, had been let go some time back, pointing the finger somewhat at his company, saying we have to look in the mirror at some of the problem and somewhat at outside forces. However, the company maintains the new line of Yak's action figures are selling well. Vince McMahon said that despite reports that came out that this was the case this past week, the company is not lowering its television ad rates temporarily, and that ad rates for the upcoming season are being increased. In addition, the company incurred greater expenses in managing its retail marketing and an additional cost of the move to TNN because of the court decision coming in so late. Linda McMahon held a press conference on September 28 after the first news broke and the stock had taken a substantial fall to announce the purchase of up to $10 million of Class A common stock as approved by the company's board of directors. The move was a way to calm panicking stockholders that seemingly were overreacting to the profits being below projected, which is a combination of the fact that Wall Street still has minimal faith in WWF as a long-term property due to the perceived faddish nature and cyclical nature of pro wrestling, and the general panic over any bad news, due to many fears of a widespread imminent economic collapse as has been predicted by many economic experts. The fact it wasn't just wrestling can be noted by an even bigger drop in Apple Computer stock when it had a similar report that its profits would be less than projected. Linda McMahon said they would be discounting the older merchandise that hadn't sold well as a discount to clear them out, and that things should stabilize by the first of the year. She also said the company was considering legal action against the Parents Television Council, claiming they have made incorrect statements regarding their role in companies that pulled out from advertising on SmackDown. Linda McMahon claimed in the PTC's list of sponsors that have pulled out of the show based on their campaign included sponsors that actually pulled out before the PTC began its campaign. The PTC did include in its list some sponsors, such as Wrigley's, that pulled out of buying pro wrestling long before it became a PTC issue and actually long before SmackDown even existed on its list, so her claim is correct. What makes that surprising is that by opening that up as an issue, it pretty well states that there have been sponsors that have pulled out not as a result of the PTC, which contradicts many impressions the company has tried to project in the past, and has successfully convinced its audience of, that the sponsor boycott was mainly the result of one right-wing lunatic individual and or group as opposed to many different companies, many of whom acted independently. Linda McMahon also claimed PTC has listed other companies that have pulled out that never sponsored the show in the first place. Vince McMahon pointed out General Motors, which was never a national sponsor on SmackDown, as being on the PTC list, saying that PTC may have gotten assurances from some companies that don't sponsor in the first place that they wouldn't sponsor due to content and use them in a list of major companies that are refusing to sponsor, which is misleading because people are under the impressions those companies actually pulled out of the show. It should be noted that General Motors has bought SmackDown ads at the local level in the past. Both McMahons expect that Coke, the largest sponsor of all that pulled out last year, which has claimed to have done so independently of the PTC, although Vince felt the PTC did have something to do with that, would sponsor the product again, but Linda at the press conference said she didn't expect it to happen within the next several months. Vince McMahon also felt some of the armed forces, that all pulled out late last year directly from the PTC campaign, would eventually return to sponsoring the show. Vince McMahon noted that the PTC met with a major WWF sponsor, ConAgra, this past week. ConAgra is the parent company for, among other things, Chef Boyardee, which has a huge ad campaign based around WWF wrestlers Mick Foley, Rock, and Chris Jericho, as well as Slim Jim's, a longtime pro wrestling sponsor. The PTC claimed that ConAgra agreed to pull out of doing business with the WWF after its current contract expires, but would not pull out until that point. Vince McMahon said that he expects ConAgra to remain a sponsor. The lower than projected revenues and higher than projected expenses actually more than made up for an increase over budget in the income from the wrestling presentation end of WWFE business, which indicates the actual business that fuels everything is still showing no signs of a decline. Both house show revenues remain higher than budgeted, as well as revenues from pay-per-view. The WWF is projecting 400,000 buys for its non-major PPVs through the rest of the year, and with Austin in the fold, there is a good chance those numbers will remain ahead of pace. Dwayne Johnson has reportedly inked a $5.5 million deal with Universal to play the lead and title role in Scorpion King, a prequel to Mummy 2, which Johnson debuts the role in. The movie, which will include Vince McMahon getting an executive producer credit, is expected to begin filming next spring, and Johnson is expected to be working on the movie for approximately 6 months. They may work his schedule to allow him to continue working pay-per-view shows and some television tapings during that period, or they may have him take a sabbatical. It would seem to be impossible given the publicity surrounding wrestling and the movie for them to do what old-school wrestling would have done in a similar situation, as in shooting a major injury angle right before he leaves to give him a big program to return for. Vince McMahon said that the current plan is for Johnson to begin filming after WrestleMania, but with a strike in Hollywood as a possibility, that schedule could be moved up slightly. He said he expects Rock would remain having a presence in the WWF core product and would be available during the movie filming, but it would be a limited one. Meanwhile, ECW is still on TNN and is still financially not on strong footing. The company presented what came across as a typically good pay-per-view show on October 1st, Anarchy Rules from the Roy Wilkins Auditorium in St. Paul, Minnesota. The show, before an estimated 4,600 paying $165,000 in a 7,000-seat arena, was headlined by local wrestler Jerry Lynn capturing the ECW title for the first time over Justin Credible. The match signified the card itself. Both wrestlers worked very hard. Although the crowd got into it down the stretch big, the wrestlers did struggle early with the crowd, which was disappointing as far as reactions most of the night. Somewhat similar to the WWF crowd in Philadelphia its previous pay-per-view. The show was also marred by terrible TV production. All the ref bumps at the finish made the product look too WWF-ish, since it resembled most WWF title match main events, and in that way kind of diluted the title switch a bit, but it made for some easy pops. My feeling is the wrestling itself was strong enough to make it a thumbs-up show, and most of the reaction to the show was positive, but I also couldn't help but feel that to a casual fan, if they were to view the product, they would come across as hard-working non-stars and look minor league because of how high the production standards fans are used to these days. Since ECW on pay-per-view is probably drawing largely its base audience, it was a good show for that audience, but there was nothing on the show that anyone is going to stick in anyone's memory either. The show was also shorter than most PPVs, ending at 10:34 p.m., and that's with a lengthy music video with Limp Bizkit after the conclusion of the main event in what appeared to be a promotional trade-off with FarmClub.com. Although many have speculated this had something to do with a deal with the USA Network, it was a separate deal. Many of the transitions when going from live to tape were abrupt. There were so many examples of sound not being right on the taped promos, and even after the main event, a live mic not working for Lynn's speech, that if you didn't know better, you'd think they were shooting an angle to turn the production crew heel, since the TNN heel angle has just about run its course. The shorter show wasn't a negative, because it kept things moving and none of the matches dragged, which has been the case in the past with ECW trying to fill up that much time. FarmClub.com is also a TV show on the USA Network, which drew deceptively good ratings for a while since it aired after Raw, which often left the air with the rating 5 minutes into the hour in the 8s. This fueled more rumors of an ECW/USA Network deal, particularly since Paul Heyman had reported individually told some ECW wrestlers that it was a done deal the previous weekend. Again, there have been no confirmations of this, and according to sources, Barry Diller had not yet approved of ECW being on USA, although reports are that negotiations have continued and gotten more serious. The show also exemplified a dilemma facing every promotion. The reality is that pro wrestling as an event with atmosphere is probably best presented in a smaller venue with the crowd close to the action. But there is a limited amount of money that can be made doing this. One of ECW's problems is that Heyman has often presented the product in buildings for atmosphere, such as the ECW Arena or the Elks Lodge in Queens, but that even with a full house, the show itself ends up being a money loser. The idea is the presentation of the live events can be a loss leader, as it is nowadays with most indie groups that rely on getting students paying a few thousand to join their wrestling schools as the money-making end of running the company, but with a company with a real payroll, you need to make live events profitable. The reality is that the ECW product didn't play well in a 6,000-seat arena, and not only because they couldn't fill the building for a major pay-per-view event. 1. Danny During, Dan Morrison, and Roadkill, Mike DiPaoli beat Christian York, Adam Birch, and Joey Matthews, Jason Spence, in 7:15. During jumped off Roadkill's back and dive outside the ring with a plancha that was designed to have him splat on the arena floor to set up Matthews and York doing a double tope. During at one point dropped the leg off the top on Matthews, but then York dropped the leg off the top on During. Crowd died about 5 minutes in. During pinned York with the buggy bag, which was a leg drop to the back of the head. It's one thing to give someone's regular finish a signature name to identify it with the wrestler, but in ECW, they try that with every one move in the wrestler's repertoire, and it made Styles, who can be very good, so annoying only one match in. Everyone shook hands after. This brought Simon Diamond and Swinger out, and they laid out York and Matthews with chair shots and did their double-team problem solver on During. Swinger had an orbital bone injury and couldn't wrestle, so they did this and another run-in as their appearances on the show. 1.5 stars. 2. Kid Cash, David Cash, pinned Easy Money, Jason Broyles, in 9:39. This segment started out with Joel Gertner and Cyrus, who, by the way, has got pop. Cyrus ran Gertner down and basically said the match wasn't going to take place because he's got someone for Gertner to wrestle, and Money, Chris Hamrick and Julio De Niro all came out. Spike Dudley came out in the Mick Foley commissioner role, and basically it came down to Cash having to beat Money or the Gertner-Cyrus match wouldn't take place. This pretty well guaranteed the result, but the two put on a tremendous lucha-style match. Money did a brainbuster-like move that popped the crowd. He did a tope but ended up hitting Hamrick. Cash did a sensational double springboard flip dive. Money did an upside-down rocking horse right out of Mexico, which was called the Pendulum of Pain. Cash did an incredible double springboard Hurricane Rana. Cash did his Money Maker, which is a form of a double-arm DDT, but Elektra distracted the ref. Sanchez ran in and used the Naoya Ogawa STO, and Sanchez and Money did a double wheelbarrow suplex. Hamrick came off Money's shoulders with a leg drop while Money was on the top rope, but Cash kicked out. Money then set up a power bomb while standing on the top rope, but Cash turned the move into a Hurricane Rana for the pin. After the match, Hamrick laid out Cash with a springboard dropkick into a De Niro powerbomb. Spike ran in and put the acid drop on De Niro. Money clipped Spike's bad leg, and Money put Spike in the figure 4 until Sandman ran in and hit everyone with a cane shot, including Hamrick taking a flip bump off the apron. Sandman teased caning Elektra, who teased giving him oral sex, I guess, as an exchange. He poured beer down Elektra's top and then shoved Gertner's face in her cleavage. 3.5 stars. 3. Joel Gertner pinned Cyrus Don Callis in 2:34. Gertner speared Cyrus and then took off his jacket. He had stars painted on his boobs and was pretending to be Kimala, which was hilarious for those who knew. But Kimala was apparently before the time of the majority of the crowd because very few seemed to recognize what he was doing live. He set up doing a people's elbow, but Cyrus tripped him. Finish saw Sandman spit beer in Cyrus' face and Gertner schoolboyed him. Obviously no wrestling to speak of, but it wasn't a disaster as these kind of matches often can be. Dud. 4. The Baldies, Angel Medina and Tony DeVito, defeated Balls Mahoney, John Reschner, and Chili Willie, Will Jones, in 7:39. Basic juice match, which really didn't mean much on the show since there was so much juice elsewhere. Mahoney cut up both Baldies using a fork right away. DeVito did do a moonsault block off the stage on Mahoney while Angel powerbombed Willie on chairs outside the ring. When the faces were selling, the fans were chanting for the New Jack run-in since this is the match it takes place in on every pay-per-view show. Baldies hit each guy with 3 chair shots and scored simultaneous pins. The chair shots weren't brutal by ECW standards, but since they were shots to the head, we should be thankful for that. 3/4 star. Lou E. dangerously laid out Gertner and Styles attacked Lou. This was basic storyline to get Gertner out of the announcing and put Cyrus in for the key matches. 5. Steve Corino pinned C.W. Anderson Chris Wright in 12:47 in what was billed as a match to determine the #1 contender for the ECW title. Don Marie was with Corino, of course. Styles told a good story early that the two were friends on the independent scene for years, which made sense since the wrestlers were telling the story that they knew each other's moves. They did a chop fest. Anderson juiced after a chair shot. The crowd wasn't into the match, so that hurt the portrayal of Corino as a main eventer and title contender that this was supposed to do. Corino juiced after a chair to the head. Corino sold his arm after having his shoulder whipped into a chair in the corner. Corino made a comeback doing a bunch of Dusty Rhodes spots, which even they didn't pop the crowd at all. Diamond and Swinger brawled with Jack Victory to the back. In the ring, Corino delivered the old school explosion, which is a move similar to the twist of fate, on a chair, for the pin. 2 stars. 6. The FBI, James Maritato and Charles Spencer, retained the ECW tag titles, beating Mikey Whipwreck, John Watson, and Yoshihiro Tajiri in 8:38. This match was better than average, but hugely disappointing in that it wasn't even close to being in the league of their 2 previous bouts, both of which had been on free TV and led to high expectations out of this. The Sinister Minister threw fire at Mamaluke only 2:30 into the match as a transition spot, which was very strange when fire is used with no real storyline purpose. FBI did a double-team powerbomb off the middle ropes on Whipwreck. Guido juiced. Match was lacking heat. Tajiri sprayed Mr. Guido, but Sal E. Graziano pulled ref John Finnegan out of the ring to stop his count. Minister hit Sal with his walking cane, but Sal came back and squashed him. Tajiri threw the belt at Graziano to save his manager's life. Tajiri then delivered an Osai moonsault on a stunned Graziano. In the ring, Guido hit Whipwreck with a title belt shot, which is the most overdone, and also because of it, the most believable finish in wrestling today. Maritato pinned Whipwreck after a double-team Tomahawks. Fans gave both teams a nice ovation when it was over. 2 3/4 stars. 7. Rhino Terry Garrin pinned Rob Van Dam Robert Shatkovsky in 12:41 to retain the TV title. This was very different from the normal Van Dam match, as it wasn't a one-man highlight show. Actually, with the exception of the fast count finish, which took the edge off the impact of the surprise pin, this was better than most Van Dam matches because it was different. The two brawled in the crowd. Rhino whipped Van Dam into the guardrails and later speared him into the guardrail. Rhino pressed Van Dam over his head from outside the guardrail back in and onto a chair. Van Dam did a Van Daminator off the guardrail on Rhino. Van Dam did his trademark flip dive and also did a moonsault and a frog splash. Van Dam hesitated before making the pin attempt and Rhino kicked out. Rhino came back with a spear and a piledriver off the apron through a table. Van Dam came back with a Van Daminator. As Van Dam was on the top rope, Credible came out and hit him with a cane shot. Van Dam still did the Van Terminator, but Rhino pulled Bill Alfonso in the way. Rhino came back with a spear through a table and a piledriver on a chair, and heel ref Danny Daniels fast counted Van Dam out. They sold Alfonso being hurt badly, playing off the recent Paul Orndorff injury, including taking the camera off him, but it was all an angle other than Alfonso may have broken his thumb. 3 1/4 stars. 8. Jerry Lynn won the ECW title from Justin Credible, Peter Polacco, in 1936. Credible got a lot of heat from the Twin Cities crowd by wearing a Green Bay Packers Brett Favre jersey. Credible took a Harley race bump over the top and Lynn used a baseball slide and a plancha. Lynn hit his elbow on the guardrail in doing the move, as either Credible wasn't in the right position to fully catch him or he dove too far to the side. They traded punches and chops to the back, with Credible rubbing Lynn's face on grating for the Anarchy Rules setup. Despite the work and the hometown guy going for the title, he didn't pick up until Credible grabbed the house mic and started insulting the crowd heavily. At this point they started pelting the ring with garbage. Lynn brought in a table and went to the top, but Francine stopped him from going off. Credible then slammed Lynn off the top through the table and used a powerbomb for a near fall, and the crowd popped huge when he used his That's Incredible piledriver and Lynn kicked out. Earlier Credible had kicked out of Lynn's cradle piledriver. Credible knocked down ref H.C. Locke for not counting to 3. Lynn did a rolling reverse cradle, but Danny Daniels ran in to make the count, and then stopped at 2 even though Credible didn't kick out. Lynn set up his cradle piledriver on Daniels, but Francine stopped him with a cane shot. Credible went for a pin and Daniels counted fast, but Lynn still kicked out. Daniels hit Lynn with a cane and hit That's Incredible again. Daniels went for the pin and stopped the count when New Jack came out. New Jack's music played late as Daniels was selling the run-in before the music played. New Jack killed Daniels until Credible laid out Jack with 3 cane shots. Lynn set up the cradle piledriver, but Credible reversed it to set up his piledriver, but Lynn reversed it back and hit his move, and H.C. Locke recovered to count the pin. All the faces in the promotion came out to congratulate Lin, and for good measure, the mic didn't work for him to make his speech. 3.5 stars. The situation involving All Japan and Pro Wrestling Noah as it pertains to Vader and Too Cold Scorpio heated up this week when Noah announced both men on its next tour, which begins on October 7th. Where that heats up is that Scorpio had previously been announced as appearing on the All Japan October tour. While it had long been expected that Vader would join Noah and become the foreign booker, in recent weeks there had been talk of him wanting to switch back to All Japan, although most of those rumors started circulating after Vader and Mitsuharu Misawa cut a deal in Hawaii a few weeks ago. Leon White made the first decision to leave about 6 weeks after his career-threatening elbow and wrist surgery when he felt All Japan breached his unique contract, and that, combined with the fact it appeared Noah was getting the Nippon TV deal, and that virtually every major native wrestler with the company except one had left All Japan. He made the final decision 2 weeks ago to go with Noah after he and Scorpio met with Misawa and is scheduled to sign a contract with Noah through 2004, presumably at a major press conference in Japan, shortly after this publication's deadline. White, 44, signed a contract with All Japan in late 1998, during his first year with the company while Shohei Baba was still alive. It was a small one-page contract through the end of 2002. A second, more detailed contract, negotiated by Misawa and White over a several-month period when Misawa was All Japan Company president, which amended the first one, was signed in 1999. Gave him a contract breakthrough for foreign wrestlers in Japan and that he would be paid a certain agreed-upon amount if he couldn't fulfill his contract due to in-ring injuries, and also paying for medical expenses for injuries suffered in the ring, which Japanese offices had in most cases not paid to foreign talent. It also gave him a minimum annual salary because it guaranteed a certain number of weeks per year, even if the company cut back on its number of house shows. Typically, All Japan had signed wrestlers to contracts based on a certain amount of pay per week as opposed to a minimum per year. When White had his elbow surgery earlier this year, All Japan didn't pay any medical expenses or pay him while off due to the surgery, which he considered a contract breach. There may be a legal question if All Japan gives him back pay dating back to the injury and pays for the medical bills, if at that point, the contract Misawa signed him to while in All Japan would be considered binding and supersede the new contract he would be signing this week, or if a lack of payment in a timely fashion would still be considered a breach. Those close to White say that had he been paid while injured as was in his contract, whatever decision he would have wanted to make in the split would have been a moot point because he would have been legally bound to Japan for the remainder of the 4-year deal. All Japan claims it also has Scorpio under contract, although others say Scorpio never had a contract with the company. Scorpio was said to have made the move because he was unhappy because they weren't booking him enough weeks per year and not using him on every tour. Motoko Baba has threatened to take legal action against both men and against Misawa and the Noah promotion, claiming a contract breach and tampering. In even more shocking news, on September 30th, which was a special party to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the beginning of Shohei Baba's wrestling career, both Baba and Inoki had their first pro matches on September 30th, 1960. Motoko Baba announced All Japan would promote a Jan. 28th show at the Tokyo Dome without the help of New Japan. They strongly hinted of a Genichiro Tenryu vs Toshiaki Kawada main event. Kawada talked about promoting the show as a memorial-type card for Baba, and because it is for Baba, he also surprisingly, given the legal situation that seems to be going down, said that the Noah group should join the card. Tenryu talked about having Onita, Nobuhiko Takada, Kazushi Sakuraba and Masaaki Sadake as joining the show. Vader will be returning to action on October 7th after injuries that were originally told to him to have been career-ending. White suffered torn ligaments in his elbow, nerve damage as well as a broken wrist early in the year and did 3 tours with All Japan with the injuries until his hand was beginning to atrophy and his fingers were starting to curl up. After the pain became unbearable, Vader and Misawa shot an angle during this year's Champion Carnival Tour to explain his leaving before the end of a tour for surgery. He underwent 7 hours of surgery in Colorado where he was told it was less than a 50% chance of regaining full use of his hand, which had been largely numbed by that point. At the time All Japan was going through its other problems with the wrestlers leaving, they were at a stalemate with White. He was asked to return by All Japan for the subsequent tour, actually just weeks after the surgery, while White wanted what he believed was his contracted pay and payment for his medical bills while undergoing the rehab. The surgery included taking the nerve, repairing it, and transplanting it back 3 or 4 inches away. A couple of more Olympic notes. Alexander Karalin's loss to Rulon Gardner was actually his first loss since early 1987 at a Russian national championship meet when he was 19 years old, so it was roughly 13.5 years of consecutive wins without even a draw and only a few times before this match being taken into overtime. The point Gardner scored on him in the second round was the first point scored over Karelin since either 1993 and the second since 1990, and what was a shame in a sense was the nature of the point that decided the match. Rulon Gardner's win was being called the greatest upset in wrestling history, and Olympic historian David Walachinsky called it the greatest in Olympic history, even above the miracle on ice in 1980 when the U.S. beat the Soviet Union in ice hockey. After seeing the match, the two key points were that it was really such a subtle point, and for a match that will go down historically, it was almost a fluke coming on a relatively new rule that had never been used in a previous Olympics, and because of it, a very sad way to end a record that may never be equaled. Karelin simply broke his grip momentarily before Gardner did, in a position where the first person to break the grip loses a point, which turned out to be the only point of the match. The scene they showed on tape of Gardner's wife calling her father back in Wyoming on the cell phone after he won was from a dramatic standpoint, the real high point that, and just seeing Karelin immortalized by standing in the silver medal position during the medal ceremony and needing to be consoled after a loss were far more impactful than anything in what really was a stalemate of a match. The low point was before the match, when they had the guy do a total hill Russian promo claiming to be Karelin translated. That would have been a tremendously well-produced 1970s pro wrestling piece to introduce a new heel to the territory, but it was embarrassing seeing it on NBC for the Olympics, and in modern times was reminiscent of WCW's introduction of Alex Wright as Berlin. It was so over the top. Hector Millon of Cuba, who has talked about going into pro wrestling in Japan, ended up placing 5th in the same super heavyweight division. With the win, Gardner would probably get several pro wrestling offers, more likely the real lucrative ones would come from Japan, although his win was put over big on Raw in the opening segment, including by Rock, which seems to indicate some WWF interest. Gardner has talked about wanting to get into pro wrestling, recognizing that is his only chance to cash in on the win. It would be great in another era to parlay all the publicity and the huge audience that saw the match on NBC TV into pro wrestling, but Gardner doesn't have a good look or a flattering physique for the current American cosmetic scene, although physiques can change. His would require massive changes to fit into the WWF look. WWF did strike gold with Kurt Angle, and were successful with Ken Shamrock, and have high hopes with people like Sheldon Benjamin and Brock Lesnar, in taking real competitive combat athletes, which would make them far more receptive to attempting to do it once again. The only one that would likely be tabbed as a failure in that regard over the past few years was Dan Severn. Also, the story of the win dissipated greatly once people actually saw the match, as it was huge news all day until the match played and people realized it really wasn't the US hockey team beating Russia, but simply a fluke point in a stalemate. On that score, Gardner could be compared as far as size and looked to be a nicer looking and less menacing version of Gary Albright, who did achieve stardom, but only in Japan. He'd also likely get offers from various shoot-fighting organizations. Again, the most lucrative offers would likely come from Japan. While it was billed that Karelin failed in his quest to become the 4th athlete in history to win 4 consecutive gold medals in the same event, that only applies to an individual sport. British rower Steve Redgrave just won a gold in his 5th consecutive games as part of the men's heavyweight coxless 4-man team. Can you imagine him being asked by someone in the general public what event he won his 5 gold medals in? Katsuhiko Nagata's gold medal loss to Filiberto Azcui of Cuba was actually a total destruction. When Azcui went up 11-0, the match was stopped due to the 10-point mercy rule. Realistically, Nagata was very lucky in the draw to pick up a silver, as there were 19 wrestlers in the tournament and Nagata only went 2-2, but advanced on a few injury forfeits all the way to the semifinals after losing his second-round match. He scored a strong win in the semis before being outclassed in the finals. Of major interest, Anton Geesink, a former main event pro wrestler in the early days of the All Japan promotion and a 1964 gold medalist in judo, presented the medals in the 152-pound weight class. It was a real big deal in Japan for Nagata to get his medal presented by Geesink, because he is very well known in the Japanese media as well as by older wrestling fans and the more tradition and history-based company. Nagata's silver medal was the lead news on virtually every 6 p.m. newscast on September 27th in Japan, because the younger brother of a somewhat well-known pro wrestling celebrity got the medal, as Yuji Nagata was interviewed in virtually every newscast. There were more than 70 reporters at the New Japan Dojo with Yuji Nagata, Manabu Nakanishi, Wataru Inoue and Hiroshi Tanahashi watching the gold medal match on television. On September 28th, virtually every newspaper put the Nagata silver medal as the lead sports story. Yuji Nagata talked about wanting to have Katsuhiko as his second at the October 9th Tokyo Dome show. One would expect New Japan to have considerable interest in the younger Nagata as a potential junior heavyweight star, considering the success that company and Japanese wrestling historically has had with former Olympians including Hiroshi Hashi, Naoya Ogawa, Jumbo Tsuruta, Masa Saito, Thunder Sugiyama, Bad News Allen, and Yoshiaki Yatsu, as well as current booker Riki Choshu. The news stories went into the family background, growing up with a father, the local high school baseball coach, who was a big wrestling fan of Rikitozen, Giant Baba, and Antonio Inoki, religiously watching pro wrestling on television, and he took his sons to the local shows when the major promotions would come to town. Both Yuji and Katsuhiko used to, as kids, play pro wrestler with each other. In freestyle, Kerry McCoy of the United States, who has indicated interest in going into pro wrestling, ended up placing a disappointing 5th as a super heavyweight. Abid Jadidi of Iran, who lost a very controversial decision at 220 in the 1996 Olympics in the gold medal match to Kurt Angle after they ended overtime still tied 1-1, ended up picking up a bronze in that division. The first of the 2000 Olympians to go into pro wrestling appears to be Ednan's da Silva, 24, of Brazil, who placed 7th at 171 pounds in women's judo and debuts for LLPW in the L1 shoot tournament on November 22 at the Tokyo Yoyogi Gym. LLPW President Rumi Kazama said that more Olympic fighters would be announced over the next few weeks. William Salaweko, a fixture in the world of pro wrestling for the past 4 decades under the ring name of Klondike Bill, passed away early October 3 after a long bout with bulbar palsy, a neuromuscular disorder similar to Lou Gehrig disease, at the age of 68. Bill was a star wrestler, particularly in the 1960s, playing the role of a powerhouse lumberjack billed from Kodiak Island, Alaska, under phasing out of wrestling and working for Jim Crockett Promotions and later World Championship Wrestling as the head of the ring crew. He was actually Canadian, born in Calgary, and trained in the late 50s under Stu Hart, who gave him the Klondike Bill ring name when he started out in 1959, which stuck with him the rest of his life. He wrestled around the world, before finishing his career for Crockett in the 70s, and began working for the promotion after his career ended, full-time around 1977, although his final match is believed to have been in 1978. Because the disease, which he discovered earlier this year, robbed him of his prolific power, his past few months have been very difficult, needing a breathing machine, and was basically bedridden with the exception of the occasional trips to the bathroom or the living room. In recent weeks, his condition had worsened. He had been having health problems since December, which didn't go correctly diagnosed. At one point doctors thought he had suffered a series of mini-strokes. He went back to work in March, but he had started deteriorating so fast he knew he couldn't go out again, as his speech started to get so weak that by the end of March, he no longer could talk. Bill, who was very popular among just about everyone in the WCW organization, originally got over in the South after leaving Calgary in the early 60s doing a strongman gimmick, reminiscent of Yukon Eric, who was a big draw in the 50s. He worked all over the world, but was a fixture in the Southeast and had a strong early 60s run in California as a tag team partner with Haystacks Calhoun, billed as the world's largest tag team, and later with Peter Maivia. His biggest run came in the mid-60s while teaming with Abe Jacobs to feud with the Missouri Mauler Larry Hamilton and Professor Boris Malenko in the Carolinas, but also worked in Japan, China, Australia and New Zealand in the 60s, as well as the Oklahoma, Texas, and Georgia territories before moving to Charlotte permanently in 1974 and winding down his career. Bill had a legendary 1963 match against Rikitozen before a huge television audience for a live show in prime time. He was brought in under the name The Brute, billed as one of the strongest men in the world, for a 2 out of 3 fall match. During the first fall, Rikitozen gave him a backdrop, and he was legitimately knocked out and the match ended. Rikitozen was noticeably furious in the ring at the match ending long before the live TV show was to end in what, because of that, became a well-remembered match. It was also a poor match, and it wasn't until 5 years later that he was ever brought back to Japan. Bill, who was never known as a good worker inside the ring, had improved a lot by 1968, when he was brought in with a major push under the Klondike Bill name, billed as a Canadian lumberjack who lived in the mountains in solitude with a gimmick that Jos LeDuc would make famous years later. He was pushed so strongly at first that he pinned Giant Baba, who did few jobs in that era, on July 26, 1968 in Asahikawa with a big splash to set up an international title match later in the tour that Baba won. He also held the All-Asian Tag Team titles during that tour, teaming with Skull Murphy to beat Michiaki Yoshimura and Kentaro Oki on July 8, 1968 in Tokyo, before losing the belts back on July 30, 1968 in Sapporo. Bill main event frequently on that tour in tag team matches, mainly with both Murphy and Ray Stevens as his partner, including a match on August 4, 1968, where he teamed with Stevens and Bruno Sammartino, losing to Oki and Baba and Antonio Inoki. After retiring, he worked both on the ring crew for Crockett Promotions but also as head groundskeeper at Crockett Park, home of the old Charlotte Orioles minor league team, and befriended Cal Ripken Jr., who was beginning his career at the time. He was working the baseball job when Sandy Scott, who was working in the front office for Crockett, hired him to set up and take down the ring as well as carry it from city to city. Going against new fall season openers on the network, including a huge rating for Everyone Loves Raymond on CBS, the overall audience for Monday Night Wrestling was the second smallest in several years, with an average of 8.2 million viewers in the head-to-head hour, which competed with both Raymond and Monday Night Football. Although the competition from the Olympics was just as stiff the 2 previous weeks and would theoretically siphon more viewers from wrestling, both wrestling and football numbers remained at a low level. Raw, in its second week on TNN on October 2nd, drew a 5.40 rating, 4.82 first hour, 5.91 second hour, and an 8.0 share, down slightly from the previous week. Nitro drew a 2.62 rating, 3.07 first hour, 2.17 second hour, and a 3.8 share. Raw was the second lowest rating of the year in its regular time slot, ahead of only the July 3rd show, and the weekend shows moving from USA to both TNN and MTV over the past week were down 25 to 30% of what they were doing on USA. USA Network can't crow much about it, because its programming in the old Raw time slot, UFO's Best Evidence at 9 p.m., drew a 1.1, followed by Alien Autopsy, Fact or Fiction, drawing a 1.3. Nitro was the lowest rating for the show since August 14th. Raw peaked with the Angle vs. Triple H main event with a 6.08 rating. After Nitro ended, Raw also got high marks with a 5.99 for Rock and Rikishi vs. Kane and Benoit and 6.01 for the Austin, Foley, Gun confrontation and three-way with Blackman vs. Inc. Nitro's main event with Booker regaining the vacant title by beating Jarrett drew a 2.64. Head-to-head quarters saw Raw at 4.40, Rock, Angle, Foley, Triple H and Stephanie promo to 2.35, Jarrett and Booker vs. Steiner and Sting, Raw at 5.34, promo continues, adding Benoit, Kane and Rikishi to 1.76. Skipper vs. Nash and Sanders, Raw at 5.04. Hardys vs. Too Cool Taz and Raven and X-Pac vs. Jericho and Dudleys to 1.92. Goldberg vs. Harris Twins, David Flair Bagwell Angle, and Raw at 4.49. Jackie vs. Lita in Bathroom to 2.64. Booker vs. Jarrett. Monday Night Football with the Kansas City Chiefs vs. Seattle Seahawks drew an 11.39 rating, which is terrible for the show, leaving the season average at 12.5, down 9.4% from the first 5 weeks of last season. SmackDown drew on September 28th a 4.74 rating and a 7.6 share. Thunder ratings on September 27th took a major spill, down to a 1.97 rating and 3.1 share. The rating stayed steady, mostly between 1.9 and 2.0 the entire 2 hours. The number was a total embarrassment, being that it was the lowest rated regular Thunder taping show, with the exception of the one which went head-to-head with the final episode of Survivor, since March 8th. That poor number was drawn with the Who's the Champion cliffhanger coming out of Nitro. The rating, more than anything else, answers the question, with an exclamation point as to whether or not anyone even cares who the champion is and whether or not the title belt has been devalued to where it is meaningless even as a short-term ratings ploy. Weekend numbers for September 30th and October 1st saw Livewire at 0.9, its lowest number in years, Superstars at 1.1, which ties its low mark going back several years, and the Heat debut on USA at 1.94, which I believe would be just about the lowest mark that show has ever done when it's in its regular time slot. None of the new ratings should be taken as a sign of anything until several weeks down the line. If the numbers don't slowly move upwards, as fans gain more familiarity with the new stations the show is on, that would be a very bad trend. ECW drew an 0.7 rating on September 29th on TNN as the final show leading up to the pay-per-view, which can't be a positive sign for the pay-per-view itself. The September 26th Lucha Libre block on Galavision drew its highest rating in a few months, garnering a 2.3 Hispanic rating. Mexico. The 67th anniversary show at Arena Mexico took place on September 29th with only one major match, a one-fall match where Negro Casas pinned Dr. Wagner Jr. This sets up Casas as El Hijo del Santos' opponent in the main event on October 6th in Santos' long-awaited EMLL return for the Leyenda de Plata trophy. The two have been rivals, and on occasion partners, dating back to the early 80s and something of a Flair Steamboat-like rivalry. Los Infernales, Satanico and Rey Bucanero and Ultimo Guerrero scored the highest profile win since forming a trio over Atlantis and Villano 3 and Brazo de Plata. Pierroth Jr. grabbed the house mic, as he didn't wrestle on the show, and said he would not wrestle Sin Caras in a hair versus hair match unless he was promised a shot at Universo 2000 CMLL World Heavyweight title. It is believed the hair match will take place on October 13th, which would leave October 6th for the title match. However, when the October 6th lineup came out, neither Pierroth or any of the Dynamitas were even booked on the show. Originally they wanted to headline the anniversary show with a hair match, but decided to move it back so it wouldn't be competing with the Olympics and thus would have adequate TV time to build the match up. TV Azteca, which has broadcasted Lucha Libre from time to time, is expected to expand into the United States next year under the name TV Azteca, USA. They have already purchased several TV stations in key U.S. markets. The GWAS promotion is scheduled to debut on TV Azteca on October 7th with a tape of the show that was originally supposed to be a pay-per-view, which was the total disaster with Fishman losing his mask on top. GWAS is running the 30,000-seat Palacio de los Deportes on November 25th. They only drew about 3,000 fans to the same building on their first attempt. AAA ran one of its biggest shows of the year, the Verano de Escándalo Summer Scandal, idea taken from SummerSlam, on September 29th in Ciudad Madero. Main event was New Heels Heavy Metal and Perro Aguayo Jr. beat Latin Lover and Hector Garza via DQ in a match said to have great heat. Heavy and Garza both juiced. Ayako Hamada of the Urgent promotion attacked Aguayo Jr., and Heel Ref Tirantes DQ'd Garza and Latin for her interference. Abismo Negro beat Cibernetico. Antonio Pena was in Negro's corner, while Electroshock was in Cibernetico's. The Vipers came out and handcuffed Pena to the ropes and beat on him until Los Vados Locos made the save, along with Super Crazy. Pena ended up hitting Cibernetico with a table leading to Abismo Negro's pin. Asia Kong worked an undercard women's match. BC Promotions ran a major show on September 29th in Tijuana, drawing just under capacity, which included Zuki winning a mask versus hair match via DQ over Espectrito when Mosco de la Merced hit the ref with a chair when Zuki moved. Espectrito then got his head shaved. These are the two minis who worked a lot in the past in WWF as Max Mini, and both Mini Vader and Torito. Phobia, who is the younger brother of the original Psicosis, wrestled his brother, who wrestles in Tijuana as Nicho, in a ladder match for what was billed as the America's middleweight title, which was a made-up title. Both guys juiced. Nicho was missing a lot of moves, but the fans love him. Halloween and Damien both interfered to help Phobia. Rey Mysterio Jr. did a run-in to help Nicho, which got a huge pop, but Phobia still got the pin. The loss was to set up a hair versus hair match between the two of them on October 13th, which is the next BC Promotions show in the building. AAA runs October 6th in Tijuana with Garza defending the Mexican National Light Heavyweight title against Aguayo Jr. Scorpio Jr. is out of action after an injury suffered in a match last week due to Gigante Silva. Antifaz del Norte kept his mask on September 17th in Monterrey, winning the hair from Dandy. Villano V should be back in action in mid-October or early November. All Japan. Some of the All Japan stuff since they lost their TV will be broadcast on the Guerra channel, a cable channel that airs several of the minor promotions including Pancrase, Michinoku, Gia, and Toryuman, although the shows start in November and will air on a several-month delay. Motoko Baba also talked about wanting to open up a Shohei temple, which would have the tomb of Giant Baba and be filled with Baba artifacts, in 2002. They announced lineups for the October 14th to October 28th tour, which is mainly the Triple Crown tournament matches already listed here last week. The rest are just typical lineups. They are still billing Scorpio for the tour, including in some main events. Nothing was announced for Budokan Hall on October 28th other than the tournament final and Atsushi Onita's return to All Japan after 15 years. As part of Tenryu's deal to become a full-timer with this office, he'll still be able to promote his own independent war shows, since his wife's younger brother is in charge of the company and he didn't want to bail on family. They announced that one of the teams in the 1999 Tag Team Tournament, which starts on November 19th, would be Tenryu and Onita. Pro Wrestling Noah. Mitsuharu Misawa announced September 29th that Vader, Too Cold Scorpio and Richard Slinger would be the foreigners on the October tour, which would be the company's first full-fledged tour. Slinger, the nephew of Terry Gordy, was an All Japan undercard regular who was originally trained in Japan, who hasn't wrestled in Japan in several years. The tour runs from October 7th to October 20th, opening at Differ Ariake with a Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa and Daisuke Ikeda vs Akira Tao and Jun Izumida and Masao Inoue main event. The next day they are running their first show at Yokohama Bunka Gym with Kena Kowashi and Takao Amori vs Jun Akiyama and Yoshihiro Takayama on top, while Vader and Scorpio and Slinger face Misawa and Ogawa and Namichi Marufuji. Vader is strangely being used in the opening match on October 7th against Takeshi Morishima. October 11th is a major show at the Nagoya Aichi-ken Gymnasium, although the only strong matchup announced was Kobashi vs. Akira Tao. The final show of the tour is October 20th in Morioka with Akiyama and Takayama and Asako vs. Vader and Slinger and Scorpio and Misawa and Ogawa vs. Kobashi and Omori. The basic theme of the promotion is a four-way feud on top, with Akiyama's group, which consists of Akiyama, Takayama and Satoru Asako, Kobashi's group, with Omori and Kikuchi, Misawa's group, with Ogawa, Ikeda, Nanamichi Marufuji, and Vader's group with Scorpio and Slinger. Vader is said to be 375 pounds. This tour is considered to be a test and there is no guarantee after his surgery that he'll be able to fully recover. New Japan. Masahiro Chono announced that his mystery partner on the October 9th Tokyo Dome show against Masafuchi and Taiokia, who he had been calling Mr. T, will be Hiroyoshi Tenzan. This has to rank as one of the world's great surprises, being that Tenzan is his regular tag partner to begin with. It's right up there in the creativity department, with WCW naming Jerry Lynn Mr. JL. Kensuke Sasaki went to the October 1st Battle Arts show at Korakuen Hall with his wife, Akira Hokuto, and son to visit with the Road Warriors. Hawk and Sasaki, as the Hellraisers, were the top tag team in New Japan from 1992-94 during the period when Animal had retired from wrestling. Sasaki also said that his goal is to get the Match of the Year award for his bout with Kawada on October 9th, and compared it with the famous Riki Choshu, Sasaki's mentor, versus Jumbo Tsuruta 60-minute straw on November 4, 1985 at Osaka Castle Hall, which was that year's Japanese Media Match of the Year. On October 1st, Antonio Inoki met with Japanese Prime Minister Yoshiro Mori. Before Mori was Prime Minister, he was a major political figure during Inoki's wrestling heyday and used to frequently go to Inoki's matches and go backstage to meet with him. Well, former President George Bush used to, on occasion, attend Houston wrestling matches, and President Jimmy Carter's mother was a frequent fan, but somehow these stories never got a lot of mainstream news in this country. Inoki won't be at the October 9th Dome show. Inoki had a comeback idea for Hashimoto, but there are some bad feelings because Choshu didn't listen to the idea and instead did the start from the opening match comeback idea instead. Inoki still wants Tokumitsu Ishizawa to come back to Pride. Naoto Morishita, the president of Pride, will be attending the Dome show in an attempt to make a deal to book Hashimoto for a Pride show, which would be a huge mistake for New Japan. September 23rd TV show drew a 2.1 rating. Other Japan notes. There was very little news this past week because most of the companies felt because of the Olympics, any pro wrestling news would get such little coverage that it wasn't worth trying. Battle Arts ended its tour with the Road Warriors on October 1st at Korakuen Hall, drawing an announced 1,883 fans, with Rasta Man appearing as a Road Warrior, teaming with Animal to lose to Alexander Otska and Muhammad Yone. The Road Warriors said they would be returning in March and that hopefully Hawk will lose 25 pounds and be able to wrestle. They talked about coming back with the Australasian tag team titles that they won on that Superstars of Wrestling tour and bringing them to Battle Arts. They also shot an angle with Kazunari Murakami and Mitsuya Nagai doing a shooter's tag team gimmick, beating Yuki Ishikawa and Karl Malenko when Murakami knocked out Ishikawa with punches from the mount and a ref stoppage similar to a UFC finish. This will set up a singles match with the two of them on November 26th at Tokyo Komazawa Olympic Park Gym. Honky Tonk Man debuts for IWA Japan on October 13th at Korakuen Hall. Asia Kong and Ayako Hamada version along with company president Hiroshi Ogawa went to Mexico to try and work a business deal with Antonio Pena and AAA. Kong and Hamada will be wrestling on some major AAA shows this month after debuting at the Verano de Escándalos show. Xochitl Hamada, who has worked mainly in Mexico, announced that she would be retiring on the urgent December 24th Korakuen Hall show. Toryuman is booking a major show on December 15th in Kawasaki. Ikuto Hidaka, the young Japanese wrestler who worked earlier this year in ECW and had some hot matches against Super Crazy, suffered a broken right arm and will be out of action for 2 months, probably coming back on Battle Arts' big show on November 26th at the Komazawa Gym. FMW's big show on the next tour will be a pay-per-view on November 12th at the Yokohama Bunka Gym with the Fuyuki vs. Hayabusa rematch for the Wu title and Kentaro Kanemura defending the Wu Hardcore title against Masato Tanaka. Here and there. The Wrestling at the Chase retrospective on the tenure of Sam Muchnick as St. Louis wrestling promoter and the weekly TV show on KPLR-TV, was nominated for a Mid-American Emmy Award. Speaking of Wrestling at the Chase, longtime referee Joe Schoenberger died on October 2nd at the age of 84. Schoenberger, who was one of the featured people in that aforementioned TV special, was Mushnick's main ref from the 50s through the 70s and was also for years the head of youth baseball in the St. Louis area as well as a former Golden Gloves boxing champion. Because of the Mushnick influence, referees were protected in St. Louis and treated completely differently than in most promotions around the country, more similar to Baba's All Japan. The referees were taught to officiate the match as if it was a shoot, other than allowing the basic hair pulling or trunk pulling for the heel to establish his early heat and to know the planned finish. The blatant stuff to make the referee look stupid, intimidated or incompetent to the audience was never allowed, and the wrestlers had to make the finish make sense. The refs were taught that if the wrestler at the count of 2 doesn't raise his shoulder, even if it isn't the planned finish, you hit 3. If a wrestler is outside the ring and doesn't make it back in time, you don't slow the count or break the count, but you count him out, even if that also isn't the planned finish. A sitcom called Nikki, about a Las Vegas showgirl who marries a pro wrestler, debuts on October 8th in a Sunday 9:30 p.m. time slot on the WB network. Nikki Cox plays the lead role as Nikki White, while her husband Dwight White is played by Nick Van Esmark. White uses the ring name of the Crybaby. Many of the Revolution Pro wrestlers appear on the shows, and Kevin Nash, Hulk Hogan and Fabulous Moolah have also done guest shots. Olivia Walker, who was well known within pro wrestling as the most famous independent maker of wrestling robes, passed away on October 2nd. Walker, the wife of John Walker, Johnny Rubberman Walker, who was a Southern wrestling legend in the 70s and early 80s as Mr. Wrestling 2 after a successful career under his own name previous to that, made virtually all the robes for wrestlers known for fancy robes during the 80s, including Ric Flair, Greg Valentine, Buddy Landel, Mr. Wrestling 2 and Tommy Rich. WWC ran its Invasion tour over the past weekend using Texas Hangman, Dutch Mantle, Malia Hasaka, One Man Gang, Jim Steele, All Japan's Wolf Hockfield, and Barry and Kendall Windham. Kurt Hennig, who both IWA and WWC were interested in since he's no longer with WCW and WWF hasn't expressed major interest in him, is doing a program with Carly Colon over the Universal title, having won the title on September 30th in Bayamon. The show drew a packed house of 6,500, which was roughly the same sized crowd, but WWC had much lower ticket prices, as what IWA drew in Guanabo with Benoit versus Jericho on top. Hennig apparently won the Universal title from Carly Colon. The commissioner after the pin ordered the match restarted and Hennig simply left with the belt, and he defended the belt by getting DQ'd the next day. Fidel Sierra has jumped from IWA to WWC. Shinjiro Otani, on hiatus from New Japan as a way to bring him back as a fresh character as well as his having heat with Riki Choshu, surfaced on October 1st in Swindon, England for All-Star Wrestling with Joe Daigo of Calgary on the tour with him as Mr. Otani. He's gained between 10 and 15 pounds since leaving Japan. Also on the shows include Greg Valentine, Tiger Steel, formerly Giant Butch Masters aka Giant Warrior, and Tony St. Clair. A correction regarding WWF tribute shows. The promotion doing those is the British Wrestling Federation and not All-Star Wrestling. On the Jersey All-Pro Wrestling Anniversary Show at the Viking Hall ECW Arena in Philadelphia on November 18th, moved out of New Jersey since the bill targeted at the promotion was signed, will be headlined by the return to the building of Sabu vs. Axel Rotten. In one of the strangest stories we've heard, city officials in Gorham, Maine canceled a pro wrestling event on September 22nd in their city. The reason? The city officials were enraged at the comments by a heel wrestler, Dr. Everett Payne, real name Nate Parent of Portland, Maine, who stated in an in-character interview that Gorham was the bunghole of Maine. The local newspaper, The Phoenix, ripped on the decision, both because heels ripping the town is a part of wrestling and not something to be taken seriously, and more so because the show was promised to the Eastern Wrestling Alliance in exchange for playing 2 free shows at a family festival in Gorham for free. Eva played the free dates in exchange for receiving the Shaw School at no charge for a house show. Eva is trying to get pub from this by billing house shows for the Eva as the company that is banned in Gorham. MMA Jeremy Horn and Bobby Hoffman, coming off a loss just last week to Maurice Smith at UFC, ended up as the winners of the Rings USA Tournament Finals on September 30th in Moline, Illinois. Horn beat Josh Hall with a knee bar and Australia's top fighter, Chris Haseman, with an armbar in 236, while Hoffman took a decision win over 338-pound Eric Pele in overtime, and in the finals beat Aaron Brink, who tapped out after being knocked down with a hard punch. Brink scored a controversial win over Tom Sauer, since Brink wasn't disqualified for 3 fouls including 2 punches and a knee on the ground, which are illegal under Ring's rules. Horn and Hoffman both earned $10,000 for winning a tournament that necessitated winning 4 matches in total on 2 different shows. Similar to how K1 does its tournaments in different countries, this should put Hoffman into the King of Kings tournament. Orn is already in that same tournament and faces Randy Couture in the first round. Dan Severn addressed the comments made on the UFC broadcast regarding John Peretti's statement, saying that if he owned the UFC, he would be ashamed at the comments made by Peretti. Severn noted that on the UFC pay-per-view they called him the most decorated champion in the history of UFC, and that he holds wins over Dave Beneteau, Hank Abbott, Ken Shamrock and Oleg Toktarov in UFC competition, that he's the oldest champion in the history of UFC, has won titles in numerous MMA promotions, most of which he won via submission. Severn said that Rizzo is a great fighter and had nothing but praise for him. Severn also surprisingly agreed with all the comments made about his age and being too old. He said he was 10 years past his physical prime years, which he considers as 1984 when as an amateur, he defeated Lou Bannock in the Olympic trials but in a controversial decision, was kept off the team, and Bannock ended up winning the gold medal before his first UFC match in 1994. Mario Bustamante, an unbeaten Brazilian who has been highly regarded for years, faces Sanae Kikuta as the main event of the Pancrase October 31st show at Korakuen Hall. ECW. The paperwork for both Super Crazy and Yoshihiro Tajiri has been completed. Tajiri actually has to go for one day to Mexico City to complete everything, but it's been worked out. Crazy's legal situation is totally cleared up and he would have been available for the pay-per-view had Paul Heyman wanted to use him. Apparently the idea is that any day now, he's going to do a surprise run-in. Swinger Joseph Dorgan will be undergoing surgery on October 6th to repair a broken orbital bone. Tommy Dreamer is likely to undergo shoulder surgery, although doctors haven't pinpointed what his injury is other than it isn't a torn rotator cuff, but it is serious. The fact that Psychosis wasn't even used on the pay-per-view is telling about his future and his standing with the company. September 29th TV was a combination from Salem, New Hampshire and Mississauga. ONT. It was overall a lackluster show for the go-home week before a pay-per-view, as they seemed more intent on making anti-TNN jokes, and I cracked up when they had the Chiron reading Lou E. dangerously. He's got pop. Styles opened the show saying it was a show that wasn't supposed to air. Lou E. came out. Styles ran him down as being beneath his dignity to even talk with, and walked off. Lou E. claimed that he wrote all of Joel Gertner's material in the days when he used to be a Dudley. The problem with bringing that up is there is a sense that made him the guy in the act WWF didn't want. Gertner made a remark asking Lou if he plays Cyrus skin flute or meat whistle. The two actually did something physical before Cyrus kicked Gertner and put the boots to him. Larry King, Styles, ran in to make the save. They repeated the Rhino title win over Cash from the previous week's TV. The only new match was Credible vs. Lynn vs. Corino from Ontario. They had three-way juice. They kept making fun of the new TNN promotional campaign. Credible ended up pinning both guys to win the match, with Lynn going out first, which seemed to telegraph the title change. Match was hard-working, but missed something, and when it was over, it wasn't like I was dying to see a rematch as a pay-per-view main event. I don't know if it's the presentation, but no matter how hard these guys work, for some reason they just don't come across as major stars on this television. WCW. From TV, it appears the top stuff on the October 29th Havoc show in Las Vegas will be Booker T vs. Steiner for the title, Jarrett vs. Sting, Goldberg vs. Chronic, Storm and Duggan defending the Canadian title against Rection in a handicap match, Reno vs. Awal for the hardcore title, and Conan and Tigers vs. Douglas and Torrie Wilson. Nitro on October 2nd from the Cow Palace in San Francisco was a decently paced show with mainly illogical booking. The scheduled Mysterio Jr. vs. Guerrero ladder match couldn't take place because of Guerrero's knee injury, so it was instead made into a ladder match with the Disco Duck hanging from the top, with Conan and Mysterio Jr. beating Disco and Alex Wright, who are being called the Boogie Knights, which sounds like an indie tag team name. Mysterio Jr. looked good doing more in the ring than he has since the knee surgery, but the match had no flow and looked disorganized. Conan got the Duck to win, but the heels beat down the faces, including Disco laying Conan out with the Duck after the match. Throughout the show they showed David Flair torturing a masked man who he thought was the father, and who later turned out to be Bagwell. I'm presuming Bagwell won't turn out to be the answer to this mystery. Bagwell ended up laying David out after being unmasked late in the show. Russo proclaimed that Goldberg, because he touched him in the cage match the previous week, instead of being fired, is being forced to start a new win streak of whatever bogus number they came up with, like 176 or something. Goldberg pounded security, which included Memphis Power Pro headliner Ali, who was the security guard who resembled a smaller Tony Norris aka Ahmed Johnson. If Goldberg loses before reaching that number, he's fired. If he wins that many straight matches, only then can he get a title match. With WCW down to 5 to 8 shows most months, that's going to take until late 2002 or early 2003, and somehow I don't think they have enough patience to keep an angle consistent more than 2 weeks, let alone 2 years. Goldberg then kicked in the car window that Borash was driving. Meng showed up to attack Goldberg. Chuck Zito showed up to do commentary wearing his bowling shirt. They plugged his TV show Oz. In a hardcore title match, Sergeant Awal apparently won the title in a match with Reno when Vito interfered and Awal choke slammed Reno through a table and pinned him. Sanders, who Russo gave the commissionary powers to, overruled it and ruled Reno the winner via DQ due to outside interference, which the announcers noted was ridiculous because hardcore matches are no DQ by their nature. Granted, the hardcore title means nothing, but the funniest and saddest part of all this is that the people who script this stuff actually think it's creative the way they make all the belts meaningless. Actually, it is creative. Douglas cut a promo on Conan literally out of nowhere and then challenged Awesome. Finish saw Tori Wilson in a sweatshirt unzip her shirt to reveal a bikini top. The bikini top had magical powers, zapping Awesome of every bit of his athletic ability that the leisure suit hadn't already zapped him off, and Douglas pinned him clean with the franchiser in 135. Tigress then attacked Wilson. Beats me as to why. Douglas was about to give Tigress the franchiser when Conan made the save to set up a mixed tag on pay-per-view. Meng did a total face promo for the match with Goldberg, pretty much saying his career was over and unless he destroyed Goldberg, he'd be sent home without a job again and that he needed to win. Goldberg then speared and jackhammered him in less time than it took for the promo, 40 seconds total. Chronic then attacked Goldberg and laid him out with the high times. So they're now heels. The world title situation was to be settled with a tag match with Jarrett and Booker versus Sting and Steiner, with the winning team then wrestling each other in the main event to get the vacant title. Russo officially vacated the title that he won at Nassau Coliseum earlier in the show, even though Kat, the commissioner, claimed Booker got out first. Booker's feet actually touched the ground outside the cage first, but Russo's head crashed into the guardrail when he went through the gimmick cage first. There was a time when all that would have mattered. Match was pretty bad early, but it went long enough that the crowd got into it with Jarrett pinning Sting after hitting him with a guitar show while Steiner was pinning Booker. However, it was the Jarrett pin that counted in 10:47. It was supposed to be Skipper defending the Cruiser title against Sanders, but it turned into a handicap match with Nash teaming with Sanders, and the only way to win was using a power bomb. Fans didn't care about this at all. Nash used a power bomb, so Sanders pinned Skipper to get the title. There was a time when people would question a 6'10", 320-pound man in a cruiserweight title match. Duggan and Storm made their TV cameos by attacking the Thrillers backstage. Goldberg then destroyed the Harris twins, first spearing Ron for the pin in 14 seconds and then he jackhammered Don for good measure. The ending of the David Flair/Buff angle took place here. It was surprising they got Bagwell to play Crybaby for about 90 minutes throughout the show. Main event saw Booker regain the title in what was billed as a San Francisco 49ers match, in that there are 4 poles, 4 boxes, and in one of the boxes was the title belt and the other boxes had weapons. Whoever got the box with a belt would be the champion, and they wonder why their titles draw 0.15 buy rates? First box open turned out to be a blow-up doll. If I actually hated wrestling, I'd be laughing at this. But the saddest part is Jarrett and Booker had a damn good match even with the blow-up doll. Booker opened a second box which had a photo of Scott Hall. Booker got the third box which was a coal miner's glove. Jarrett then got the glove. It actually looked like a regular glove as opposed to a coal miner's glove. Jarrett hit Booker with the glove, and he sold it, but not like the old days. He then used a sleeper. The ref checked Booker's arm, which made no sense because it had gone down 3 times, that doesn't guarantee a finish anyway. But after doing down twice, Booker on the third one signaled he was awake. The announcers tried to explain why the ref was checking on him given the rules, which only made things more confusing. Jarrett came off the top rope with the glove, but Booker instead gave him the Uranage, followed by an axe kick and a missed side kick which Jarrett sold. Jarrett went outside the ring and tried to get a guitar from under the ring but couldn't pull it out. As he tried a second time, it was Beetlejuice from the Stern Show under the ring holding the guitar. Beetlejuice gave Jarrett a low blow, allowing Booker to win the belt in 13:02. After the match, Steiner attacked Booker with a pile and the show ended with him putting Beetlejuice in the recliner. We don't have a complete report from the October 3rd Thunder tapings in Long Beach other than a few negative reports on the show. Steiner beat all three Young Dragons, leading to a Midajah vs. Leah Meow cat fight, which ended with Steiner putting Meow in the recliner. Christopher Daniels got another tryout match, putting Kui Wee over. Jarrett did an angle where he was threatening Beetlejuice. Sting came out for the save and they brawled, and a fan, who turned out to be Douglas, attacked Sting, allowing Jarrett to put Beetlejuice in the figure 4. They did an angle where Douglas tried to sick the INS on Conan, who protested, saying he was an American citizen. Douglas then laid out Mysterio Jr. and Guerrera. Luger did an interview in the stands claiming that he wasn't under contract with WCW and running down the talent in the company. Main event was Sting vs. Douglas. Don't know the result, but Conan went to kidnap Wilson, and Jarrett hit Sting with a guitar. The March 18th pay-per-view has been moved from Skydome in Toronto, where, unless the company goes through a major upswing, it would have been a terrible bomb, to Jacksonville. Mike Tenay was originally booked to wrestle Midajah on the show, but it ended up being scrapped. They want to switch the commissioner gimmick to Sanders because the feeling is a heel commissioner makes for a better show, but Ernest Miller doesn't like that the position is being taken from him. Bill DeMott, Captain Rection, in an interview on WrestlingObserver.com with Alex Merves, noted he had suffered 6 concussions in 3 weeks doing hardcore matches against Fit Finlay and Brian Knobbs, and was told by his doctors last October that he needed to retire because of the brain damage. He said that even though it is ill-advised, he came back, although he can't even read a street sign anymore. He gets nauseous and sometimes loses his balance. He wants to wrestle for the year he has left on the contract and then retire. He's really happy how the MIA gimmick is doing, as they were just cast-offs that nobody had an idea what to do with, and largely he and Chavo Guerrero Jr. came up with some ideas that made them a regular part of the show. ICP quit again. They were asked to do a job at Thunder and didn't show up. There's something almost comical about even typing those words. At the WCW house show in Oklahoma City last week, a 5-year-old child punched Great Muta in the face. Muta spent the rest of the match selling the blow, including going back to where the child was sitting, and when he'd see the child, he'd back off, acting scared. Ric Flair was in Chicago this past week to promote the November 6th Nitro/Thunder tapings and said it would be the first show he would be medically cleared to wrestle on. Juventud Guerrera's injury was a hyperextended right knee. There was no major knee damage and he should be back in action before you read this. Guerrera signed a 2-year deal last week. Meng was telling people that he was retiring from wrestling after the October 10th Thunder show in Long Beach. A rumor of WWF buying WCW was fueled by, of all people, Antonio Inoki. When Inoki flew to Japan this past week from his home in Los Angeles, when he got off the plane, he told reporters that WWF was buying WCW, although Inoki likely has no inside knowledge of anything going on since he's not a major player in the American scene these days. Most of the serious reporters in Japan dismiss the story as just Inoki talking without knowing what he was talking about, but since it was Inoki who said it, it got substantial media play in Japan anyway. Thunder tapings on September 26th in Wilkes-Barre, PA drew 3,793 fans, which was 1,620 paying $47,380. Nitro on October 2nd at the Cow Palace in San Francisco drew 2,666, which was 1,941 paying $63,715. WWF. Regarding Raw in Canada, the September 25th show was a one-time only thing for TNN being allowed to broadcast Raw into Canada theoretically because TSN aired the Olympics. According to the Toronto Sun website, cable companies in Canada had blocked a plan put forth by both TSN and TNN to air Raw on TNN on the Monday nights when TSN had other sports programming on. TSN has 3 years left on its contract with the WWF and has expressed no interest in selling its Canadian rights to the show. What actually happened is some signals were crossed and some cable systems didn't block the TNN signal. Others in Western Canada did block the TNN signal. The Raw and TSN advertisers were furious because they were paying Raw ad rates, but the viewership, since the show aired in the regular time slot in much of Canada on TNN, had to be way down. The reason the TNN signal will theoretically be blocked from this point forward, and this could also change, is to protect the Canadian advertisers, since Canadian advertisers don't buy TNN because it isn't cost-effective for them. The Canadian advertisers were furious on September 25th because the TNN signal reached much of Canada, and therefore they bought ads based on being first-run programming that wasn't. The reason the TNN feed won't be sent into Canada even when TSN has the live Raw delayed is to protect the TSN advertisers of Raw. In an interview with Alex Merves on WrestlingObserver.com, TNN President Brian Hughes said the company was happy with a September 25th rating of 5.4. He said they were kicking around the idea of debuting at about a 5.0. The 2 hours on TNN leading into the Raw debut drew double plus the rating the same shows had done in the time slot the previous week. Hughes said the September 25th replay show was a one-time thing, because if it was a regular thing, the feeling was the replay would dilute the ratings of the live show and dilute from making Mondays at 9 p.m. appointment viewing on TNN. Regarding the programming content issue, Hughes said, "I think that may be somewhat overrated. They, WWF, are very sensitive not to cross over the line. In the past, they've done that a couple of times and realized after the fact that maybe they made a mistake. They're very sensitive to all of what's going on out there and don't want to get reprimanded by the powers that be in the industry. For instance, feeds of Monday night's show go through Stanford, so they self-censor as well as the network. We've had discussions about where they can go. It's important to push that envelope while not crossing over. All of us have been victims of doing some things maybe we shouldn't have done. You have to be cautious and learn from your past mistakes. But it's also important to try new things. We're going to walk hand in hand and all do the right thing. We may stumble here and there, but we're firmly focused on not going too far." He did say, as was evident on the debut show, there will be changes in WWF programming in regard to what is considered acceptable broadcast language on TNN as compared with USA. Hughes stated at this point ECW would be on through October 6th, and that nothing past that point has been confirmed, but there are discussions going on about furthering the relationship. Hughes said he legally couldn't talk about why WWF signed the waiver to allow ECW to remain on TNN even though their contract with the network gave them exclusivity. Raw on October 2nd from the MCI Center in Washington, D.C. was a top-level show. They started with the interview that went forever, with 1 million characters. Rock came out for a monologue. Rock can usually get away with anything, but when he ripped on Marion Barry, the former D.C. mayor who was caught on drug charges a ways back, for smoking crack, the crowd seemed uncomfortable and the pops for the rest of his monologue were well below standard. He brought up Rulon Gardner, which got a decent pop, putting him over. Rock offered Angle a shot. Angle came out and made a remark about Gardner getting press in some local papers as compared to his, since in reality Gardner's win got 50 times the press Angle's gold medal did 4 years ago due to beating Karelin. He also ran down Michael Jordan, who is part of the Washington Wizards management. Foley and Triple H came out. Triple H blamed Angle for wasting his time the past few months when he should have been directing his attentions and beating Rock for the title. Benoit and Kane also came out to challenge Rock for the belt. Rikishi came out and challenged Kane. Lawler had the greatest line in the history of Raw, when this interview segment was never ending and Rikishi's music played and he came out as Lawler said, "Maybe they can play my music and I'll get in the ring and do an interview." This overall was a good 15-minute segment. The problem is, it went 25 minutes. Hardy's beat Too Cool to keep the tag titles when Inc. interfered and Edge speared Scotty Too Hotty and Matt pinned him after Jeff did the Swanton. The Hardys' offense was somewhat toned down and Jeff's face looks like he's living with a lot of pain. Jericho and Dudleys beat Taz and Raven and X-Pac when Jericho pinned Raven after he got both 3D from the Dudleys and a Lionsault. It was basically a short sprint of a good match. RTC complained to Foley about Austin and about Playboy. Foley was looking at Chyna's pictures and they pushed Playboy still like crazy. Jackie and Lita had a backstage brawl to start their program. Jackie put lipstick all over Lita's face. At one time Jackie had some deadly empty cardboard boxes fall on her. They ended up on the hood of a truck. Jackie was thrown off and Lita set up a moonsault when Jackie blew a fire extinguisher on her and at that point it was a pull-apart. 1,000,000 times better than most women's brawls on WWF TV. Rock and Rikishi beat Kane and Benoit in a very good match when Rikishi pinned Kane after sitting on him. Benoit and Kane were getting along perfectly, which guaranteed one was going to turn, which was Benoit by hitting Kane with a chair, which led to the rock bottom by Rock and Rikishi sat on him for the pin. Foley and Austin came out. Foley told Austin not to stun everyone. He also brought out the returning Billy Gunn, who looked huge. Gunn denied running Austin over. Austin said he believed him, but since he never liked him to begin with, gave him a stunner anyway. Gunn said he saw the driver and the driver had blonde hair, which I guess makes Deborah now the likely suspect. Blackman won a 3-way over Inc. Inc. never fought each other. With Edge laid out, Christian was checking on him and Blackman kicked a chair into his face for the pin. RTC was burning the Chyna Playboys. Austin interrogated Brooklyn Brawler, who ended up taking a bump from the Invisible Man. Austin actually went to shake his hand and he freaked out and acted like he was having a heart attack and took a bump backwards over a table without being touched. Guerrero and Chyna beat Venus and Richards via DQ quickly when Buchanan and Goodfather interfered. Austin came out and stunned Buchanan, Goodfather, Richards, and Guerrero. Foley did an interview saying he had warned Austin about stunning everyone, but before he could say the punishment, Austin stunned him as well. Foley threw a temper tantrum. Angle pinned Triple H in 8:21. A good match. Stephanie came out after Triple H told her not to. After a ref bump, Benoit threatened Stephanie and Triple H came after him. Stephanie stopped Benoit from using a chair on Triple H. Benoit then went to hit Stephanie but Triple H stopped him. Benoit hit Triple H with a chair and Angle pinned him with the Olympic Slam. Triple H was furious at Stephanie since her being there theoretically cost him the match and #1 contendership and the title shot at Rock, which he said was his prime goal beginning with the end of this specific match. Seems to indicate Rock vs. Angle on top at the October 22nd show. SmackDown tapings on October 3rd in Baltimore. Highlights of Heat were X-Pac over test via DQ when Billy Gunn hit the Famouser on him. Guess they've changed their mind about sending Gunn to Memphis to get back in shape, because it appears he's going to feud with X-Pac right off the bat. Guerrero pinned Goodfather in an IC title match which was set up at the later taped SmackDown show. Triple H also pinned Saturn clean. For SmackDown, Lowdown got into the title hunt teaming with Jackie over Hardy's and Lita when D-Lo powerbombed Lita and Jackie pinned her. Lowdown laid out Hardy's after. Snow pinned X-Pac to keep the European title when Gunn gave X-Pac the Famouser. Venus and Goodfather and Buchanan beat Acolytes and Guerrero when Goodfather pinned Guerrero with a power slam to set up the Heat title match. Taz and Raven beat Dudleys via DQ when Bubba hit both with the ring bell. After the match, they power-bombed Raven through the table. Sounds like they are giving Raven the test before deciding how to push him. Foley confronted Austin and they argued. Foley said because of Austin stunning everyone and defying authority, he has no choice but to suspend him. Austin asked if he found out who ran him over and Foley didn't know. Austin then gave Foley a stunner and left. Angle and E&C beat Rikishi and Too Cool when Stephanie interfered knocking GMS off the top rope and Angle pinned him with the Olympic Slam. Blackman pinned Albert to keep the hardcore title with a kendo stick shot. Benoit beat Jericho via DQ when Triple H interfered and speared Benoit. Benoit and Triple H brawled with Triple H juicing from a chair shot to set up what appears to be a singles bout with the two. Looks like pay-per-view is Rock vs. Angle, Benoit vs. Triple H and Rikishi vs. Kane. We were told the plan is for Austin to also wrestle in a singles match. Main was Rock vs. Kane for the title. Angle interfered hitting both with a chair and then leaving. Rikishi then interfered and the ref saw that and DQ'd Rock. WWF filed a lawsuit on October 2nd against the William Morris Agency as the claim is WMA is demanding fees as its percentage of deals that WWF claims WMA had no hand in making. According to an article in Variety, the WWF is going under the legal strategy of attacking the structure of the contract because the WWF would have a more difficult time in court trying to overturn the deal itself. The WWF claims WMA is billing the WWF for agency fees in regard to some major deals the WWF claims WMA had no part in putting together, among them being the Viacom deal, the WWF/NBC deal to put together the XFL as well as the deal with UPN for SmackDown. The WWF is asking for unspecified damages, both actual and punitive, and a declaration that WMA isn't entitled to any agency commissions from the XFL deal with NBC, the WWF deal with Viacom, or from the SmackDown show on UPN. In the lawsuit, the WWF claims that the standard contracts signed by clients of the WMA are a fraudulent custom and practice designed to perpetuate a money-for-nothing scheme to enrich the agency at the unlawful expense of its clients, and not only just the WWF. WWF signed a contract with WMA on October 31, 1997, and claims in March 1999, and wrote to WMA that they were dissatisfied with the relationship and wished to terminate it. WWF is now under a representation contract with the Endeavor Agency. China did a ton of media this past week, including Howard Stern on September 29. Stern was somewhat easy on her, sort of teasing that in her photos it looked like she had a guy body, which should do wonders for sales, but that she was more attractive in person. She seemed only a little embarrassed with the questioning of her sex life, seemingly accepting it as the consequences of being in a photo shoot and promoting because of the power of the Stern show. She said she was living with Triple H and referred to him as her boyfriend, so I guess that means in real life they are back together. A caller called in mad at her for killing two different storylines on the show, presumably meaning the Triple H/Stephanie marriage and her engagement to Guerrero, and she basically said there are 22 million fans. I wonder if the wrestlers themselves actually believe that number or are just pre-programmed to say it whenever the opening comes up, and indicated she thought virtually none of them thought the storylines were anything but that. She denied ever taking steroids at any time and said she spends about 45 minutes a day in the gym and eats lots of red meat. She said her real weight was 165 pounds and indicated when a caller called up about her dropping weight that she had dropped 15 pounds of late. She ripped on Nicole Bass, basically saying she couldn't wrestle, since the obvious comparison came up, particularly since the Stern show made Bass a celebrity, and ripped on Bass' husband as well as pretty much scoffed at her lawsuit. She also heavily ripped on both of her parents, noting that her mom had kicked her out of the house at the age of 15. She actually tried to give the impression she'd never had facial cosmetic surgery or any surgeries of the type except admitting to the obvious breast implants. She called the surgery to change her jawline as a surgery to correct an underbite, which technically it was, although it was also necessary for the marketing of her in this fashion. In a sense, it was kind of embarrassing for Chyna in that she was on the show being marketed as a sex symbol for Playboy, but by the end of the interview, Stern was fawning all over Marissa McMahon, Shane's wife, who is on TV as Marissa Mazzola, who was the WWF publicist that brought Chyna to the studio. Stern was putting over how hot she was, making the jokes about marrying into such a wealthy family, talking about her being the girl next door to the McMahons when she was growing up and how when he grew up nobody looking like that lived next door. She tried to downplay it by pushing that she didn't have the body like Chyna, but by this point Stern had taken the focus away from Chyna. Undertaker could be kept out of the ring to rest his groin as long as the pay-per-view on October 22nd. Undertaker didn't wrestle at TV after the pay-per-view due to a pulled groin muscle, which is on the other side as the torn groin, which kept him out of action for months last year and the early part of this year. Jim Ross reported that WWF is negotiating an extension of Al Snow's contract, as well as signing Ron Killings, K. Crush, who has worked several dark matches, and Lita to long-term deals. At the beginning of Raw, they paid tribute to Dennis Dunn, 76, who passed away this week. Dunn was a former executive producer of the television show and father of Kevin Dunn, who currently works with the WWF heading up TV production. There will be a Slammy Awards show on UPN the night before WrestleMania. Tickets for the first 10 rows of WrestleMania at the Astrodome will be priced at $500, which would be the most expensive list price for a pro wrestling ticket ever in the United States. The remainder of the building will be set between $20 and $150, and mail orders will be taken for tickets starting on November 11th. There is talk of increasing the pay-per-view price was $34.95 to $39.95. Pay-per-view schedule after October 22nd in Albany will be November 19th Survivor Series in Tampa, December 10th Armageddon in Birmingham, Jan. 21st Royal Rumble in New Orleans, February 25th No Way Out in Providence, and Mania on April 1st at the Astrodome. It is believed the 2001 SummerSlam show will be at the San Jose Arena. Although the Discovery Channel special on UPW ended with the happy ending of Tom Howard getting a contract renewal, the reality is that his contract expired. WWF has talked about signing him to a new developmental deal and sending him to Memphis to work as a tag team with Gangrel. WWF has removed the characters of Big Show, British Bulldog, Ken Shamrock and Lillian Garcia from upcoming video game releases. One of the games has an 80-person roster which includes Earl Hebner and Linda McMahon, as well as a Ho, so the removal of Garcia is surprising. Show and Bulldog's removal seem to represent a lack of confidence that they will return to the promotion in any major capacity, especially considering Mark Henry hasn't been removed from the same games. When Foley spoke at the University of Missouri, he was asked if he was going to be pegged as the driver. He said he was asked by Vince McMahon to end up as the driver, but said he turned it down because of the release of his Christmas book aimed at young children. Charles Barkley was among the guests at Jerry Lawler and Stacey Carter's wedding in Las Vegas on September 29th. Another sign of the decline in quality of journalism for cheap ratings. War TV all through SmackDown ran teasers of a competitor to the WWF announcing that it was folding. Of course, the impression, given all the financial problems, would be that it was WCW. It was actually the All-Star Cafe's location on Times Square being taken over by a Planet Hollywood. Since All-Star Cafe is on the same block as WWF New York, I guess that makes them a WWF competitor. It has been reported that the WWF has signed 1998 Playboy Playmate of the Year, Karen McDougal, as a cheerleader who will get a major promotional push with the XFL. McDougal is expected to be featured in NBC ads that will start airing this month for the new league. Irvin Mushnick, the nephew of Sam Mushnick, who wrote numerous mainstream articles on the WWF during its scandal-laden period of the early 90s, brings up some of those issues once again in a story in theposition.com that came out on September 25th. The Philadelphia Inquirer on October 1st ran a story about Darren Drozdov. The impetus of the story was a Penn State freshman cornerback who suffered a severe spinal cord injury on September 23 and at this point is still partially paralyzed after a spinal fusion operation. Drozdov is basically paralyzed from the chest down, and has remained the same condition with no feeling in most of his body and even needs to be fed by others. Drozdov was quoted as saying, "The doctors told me it could come back slowly, it could come back all of a sudden. And a lot of times, it doesn't come back at all. It's a waiting and hoping game, basically." The injuries to Drozdov, a dislocated fourth and fifth vertebrae, were similar to those suffered by Adam Taliaferro, who fractures his fifth cervical vertebrae, although Drozdov's injuries were worse. Drozdov was married to a woman who worked for the WWF making ring costumes about a month after his injury. They moved into a new home, where Drozdov stays most of the time. The WWF paid for a $180,000 elevator in the house which is being installed to allow him to go back and forth from the first to the second floor of the house. Drozdov said that even a year later, he's still going through a shock phase. He said he'd like to help others, but you have to deal with yourself before you can help other people. But he'd eventually like to do charity work to help spinal cord victims. The Calgary Flames and DC Comics have either filed or threatened to file a lawsuit against WWFE for the New York Hitmen nickname for the XFL team. The Flames own the Calgary Hitmen and claim rights to the nickname. DC Comics had previously trademarked the Hitmen name and had made a coexistence deal for the name with Bret Hart when he attempted to trademark it. The ratings will tell the story in the long run, but I was bored to death watching the MTV version of Sunday Night Heat. The MTV personalities that hosted the show came across like largely a waste of time. Again, if this is a ratings hit, then it is a good formula, but to me watching it, it was somebody trying to present a product that they aren't. Austin's character was diluted trying to play babyface rah-rah cheerleader to a musical group as opposed to stunning all of them, which is what the public wants the Austin character to do. Taz played an over-the-top obnoxious heel, but it was such an overplayed character that it almost seemed out of the early 80s. That's going to be a tough role to keep fresh on a 1-hour weekly show, although his interview delivery for his character is very good. Michael Cole and Taz did voiceover work on matches taped the previous Tuesday, but there was very little wrestling content, and there was nothing done at WWF New York as far as surprises or comedy of any note. They should have shot a big angle to kick off the show, but instead it came across like a show that could be easily missed and a concept put together without a tremendous amount of thought put into the execution of it. Granted, it's virtually impossible to produce that much first-run television in 1 week and have it all must-see. Again, with most new TV concepts, more miss than hit, but you have to keep trying new ones. The situation with WWF allowing its talent to do wrestling media work is still up in the air. Jim Ross, on the Ross Report this week, did something of a 180, saying that John Molinaro and Slam Wrestling wrote about things that he didn't know about and now he realizes about. He hinted that he knows who the person responsible for not letting him know the problems was, but never identified that person. Ross' comments regarding this were quickly taken down from the site by the WWF. Apparently there is a policy, although there may be discussion this week about amending the policy. Benoit, Jericho, Essa Rios and Venus worked the IWA show in Guaynabo, Puerto Rico on September 30th, and with the WWF stars, they drew a crowd estimated at 6,700. Basically they are trying to keep the ship afloat in that promotion and surviving on the big gates they can draw every so often when they bring in WWF wrestlers. Venus, who was a big star in Puerto Rico years before he ever went to WWF as Sean Morley, half of a tag team called the Canadian Glamour Boys, wrestled his longtime partner Glamour Boy Shane Sewell, which ended in a DQ when Miguel Perez attacked Shane. Venus made the save for Shane, but then turned on him again after saving him. Benoit beat Jericho when Bruce Pritchard played heel ref, faking an ankle injury when Jericho had the walls on Benoit. The show was headlined by Chicky Star and Victor the Bodyguard winning the IWA tag titles from Payne and Miguel Perez. Former WWF wrestler Ludwig Borga, under his real name of Tony Halme, was knocked out in the second round by Yassine Kingbo in a boxing match held on October 3rd in Helsinki, Finland. Kingbo appeared scared to death and spent the first round running away from the much larger Halme, 37. Kingbo kept running in the second round until connecting with a right which put Halme on the deck. During the fight, which aired live on TV on Eurosport, the commentators said that Halme was a former pro wrestler, but never mentioned WWF, only New Japan. And one made this quote, "Halme is apparently very good at shoot fighting, although I have no idea what shoot fighting is." The only shoot fighting we're aware Halme did was appearing in one UFC where he tapped out to Randy Couture in 57 seconds on May 30, 1997. SmackDown in Pittsburgh at the Mellon Arena drew 11,344, paying $332,470, which was about 1,000 shy of capacity. There were no house shows on September 30th. October 1st in Richmond, Virginia drew 7,292, paying $237,131, and October 1st in Hershey, Pennsylvania drew 5,499, paying $199,141. October 2nd Raw in Washington, D.C. drew a sellout 14,683, paying $482,466. Arena merchandise for the week was $279,296 or $7.20 per head, which is a significant decrease over recent weeks, which doesn't make sense, since they ran traditionally strong markets and the return of Austin to TV should lead to a boost in those specific figures. In Richmond, Rock pinned Kane to keep the title in what was described as a disappointing show. When Jackie no-showed, they ended up with an ivory win over Harvey Whippleman, which was said to be as bad as the Patterson-Briscoe evening gown match. Raven, who got a strong crowd pop, put over Malenko in his first house show match. In Hershey, they went with Rikishi over Benoit as the main event and Angle over Jericho when X-Pac interfered. They also did an angle where Regal was giving his speech and getting the just shut up and leave heel heat. Slaughter came out and Regal attacked him. Slaughter reversed things for a while until the scene was broken up when Naked Man Mideon ran out in what was described as an entertaining show. The Reader's Pages. Madison Square Garden. Regarding sellouts in Madison Square Garden, you missed a few sellouts before the Edward Carpentier vs. Argentina Rocca match. On February 4, 1957, Rocca and Vern Gagne vs. Hans Schmidt and Karl von Hess. March 11, 1957 for Rocca vs. Schmidt and March 30, 1957 for Rocca and Perez vs. Don Stevens and Jackie Fargo. Rocca vs. Carpentier was September 16, 1957. The next show, on October 15, 1957 with Rocca and Perez vs. Killer Kowalski and Dick the Bruiser was just shy of a sellout. I'm nitpicking a bit, but the 5 consecutive sellouts you refer to in 1962, there were actually very few empty seats in the far reaches of the upper corners. I lived in the Garden from the late 40s through the early 60s, and after a 2-year hiatus due to Uncle Sam, through most of the late 60s as well. From then on, it was one of my blue periods with a who cares attitude. As much as I cared for Bruno Sammartino, I fear his ego took over at times. He certainly was a superpower at Madison Square Garden, but his claims as far as how many this and how many that are absurd. He had more than his share of sellouts, but let's not forget the bombs he headlined. Yes, television exposure, and the lack thereof, contributed to their failures, but the entire period from 1967 to 1969 was a financial disaster at MSG. They couldn't even sell out the farewell show at the Madison Square Garden on 8th Avenue or the debut show at the new venue at Penn Plaza. Of course, better days were on the horizon. I enjoy your work and found you studying of MSG and the findings very informative. Fred Hornby. Port Washington, New York. Michaels. I just got finished watching the Shawn Michaels Shoot interview produced by RF Video. I'd highly recommend this video to anyone who enjoys the sounds of ass flapping because that's exactly what Michaels talks about during the course of this discussion. The video is tremendous for historical purposes, but lest anyone think that Michaels is on the up and up with regards to his description of Montreal needn't look any farther than his ruminations caught on this video. I would pay good money to get one of those doctors you find on news programs who can analyze when someone is lying by observing their facial movements, speech and mannerisms. This becomes especially prevalent when the inevitable questions about Survivor Series 97 are asked. Watch Michaels divert his eyes from both the camera and the interviewer when asked simple questions. With a lot of the questions, he seems to suffer from Reaganitis during the Iran-Contra affair because he doesn't remember, which is surprising considering he was involved in what was probably one of the single most important events in the history of pro wrestling. Often, he'll take a long pause and stare into space before answering a question so he can concoct a safe answer in his mind. When Survivor Series 1997 is first brought up, he goes off on a 5 to 10 minute tangent while the wheels silently turn in his head and he calculates his next answer. Like a political spin doctor, he talks a lot about the incident in Montreal while really saying nothing at all, and when it's over, perhaps even raises more questions than he answers. One pseudo-interesting thing he does note is that the Wired Heart privately met with him after his talk with Vince McMahon on Wrestling with Shadows. Michaels claims, even though the interview never accused him or anything, that this audio footage would prove his innocence on the matter. How? What would we have heard? That Shawn thought it was going to be a disqualification finish? That he thought it was okay that Brett didn't want to drop the title in Canada. We would have heard the same old story except without the benefit of the video camera that shows Michaels is either a liar, a half liar, or only giving us the tip of a very large iceberg. Everyone has debated forever whether or not the whole thing was a work and who knew what and when they knew it. Nobody knows. Unfortunately, neither Hart nor Michaels are unbiased enough to shed any sort of realistic, impartial light on the situation because they both have images to maintain, previous stories to stand by, and in facets of those stories to hide. We might chalk this up with the JFK assassination and just figure only the shooter knows for sure. I'm surprised that nobody has brought up that in Wrestling with Shadows, one of the protesters in the Canadian parking lot said, "If Brett goes, we go as none other than Jason Sensation." Seems odd that someone so voluble about sticking with Brett no matter what would only months become an employee of the WWF. Sean Gorman, Boston, Massachusetts. Playboy. I'm uncomfortable with the fact the WWF is letting Chyna pose nude, not because I have any problem with Playboy, but because I think Chyna and the WWF are ignoring a big factor. Chyna is not looked at in the same light by the WWF audience as the rest of the women. She's not portrayed as a character whose major purpose is to be eye candy. Rather, she's a major character who commands respect in the storylines. As a result of being presented as an equal to men, she has both young male fans and female fans. I was a counselor at a day camp last summer for elementary school-aged kids. Not only did the girls watch the WWF, but they had a character they identified with, Chyna. While the boys would pretend to be Rock or Austin, the girls would pretend to be Chyna. I think the WWF is sending a bad message to Chyna's younger girl fans by having her do the pictorial. She was the only strong female character who wasn't a heel that young girls could get behind. By allowing her to pose nude basically offsets all the progress they have made. In my opinion, it sends a message to young girls that even the strongest woman is still just another sex object in a man's world. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, though. This is the same company that encourages young boys to chant "Save the Hose." Scott Shapiro. Orndorff. I was at the HSBC Arena for Fall Brawl. Paul Orndorff's collapse was honestly terrifying, not just from watching him go down and stay down. Not just from watching the performers seem so relieved to break character and check on their fallen co-worker/teacher, but from listening to the buzz in the audience as the fans tried to figure out if it was a work or a shoot. Naturally, the loudest and haughtiest voices were those assuring everyone in their section that it had to be fake because nobody else was touching him. Has every smart turned into a jaded, uncaring jerk? I'm surprised there hasn't been more outcry from the Buffalo sports media that after a road loss, a posse of players hurried home to appear and get physically involved in a wrestling show. Doesn't look like they took snapping their undefeated season too hard, does it? Why on earth would WCW expect retired Jim Kelly and injured Doug Flutie to show up? Given that it was a Sunday during the season, they were lucky to get anyone. Is it my imagination, or is this the first pay-per-view with scripted involvement of pro athletes during their regular season? During the scaffold match, it seemed the only way Medusa could have landed with more padding would be if she'd have fallen on her front instead of her back. Drew Bernstein. Response from Dave Meltzer. By promotions working the audience with fake shoots, it has created the atmosphere that nobody wants to believe anything, for fear of being a mark. It doesn't make people in the audience jerks, although many are, or uncaring, which probably most really are, but a product of what they've been taught. You know, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Hall of Fame. Big Daddy Shirley Crabtree and Great Gama are probably the two most controversial omissions from the Hall of Fame in my opinion. On your Ayata show, you said, "I don't even want to think about that one," when referring to Big Daddy and the Hall of Fame. It seems to me that Crabtree has good credentials. He was the biggest draw in United Kingdom history, becoming a main eventer in the early 50s, becoming the biggest star in the country by the 60s and remaining the top star through the late 80s. That's an extremely long time to be on top. At the height of his career in his feud with Giant Haystacks, 10 million people would tune in to watch the matches. That's about the same number the most watched cable matches of all time in the United States have drawn. Even more amazing, that was more than 1/6 of the entire population of the UK as viewers. That same percentage of the US population would be about 45 million viewers, a figure that has never been reached in the US. You have Bert Asarati in, since he was one of the first huge stars from Britain. On that basis, since Crabtree was an even bigger star, monumentally more well-known than Asarati, it seems he has good credentials. He was an unbelievably atrocious worker, which may have something to do with his omission. The other big omission is the Great Gama. I'm not sure how much you know about him, but I find it bizarre that Dara Singh is in but not Gama. Perhaps the fact that Gama isn't on record as ever having worked any matches comes into play? But then again, Frank Gotch and William Muldoon are in, and they worked a very low percentage of their matches to the best of my knowledge. Gama retired, supposedly undefeated, with more than 6,000 matches, which is pretty impressive. He also beat two of the top wrestlers from the Western world, Ben Roller and Stanislaw Zabishko. He beat them both decisively and also defeated top champions from Europe. He was a national hero in India. If it wasn't for India and Pakistan's embarrassing neglect toward their old sports heroes, he would still be remembered as a legend today. I really can't understand why he's not in. Justin Krast. Response from Dave Meltzer. Being that there is no way to have consistency in something like this, I think the deal with Big Daddy has to do with just how little respect he had among the wrestlers. Many credit him with the demise of British wrestling. Whether true or not, I wasn't living in England when it went down. He's basically seen as the brother of the promoter, as you wrote, a poor worker, who was pushed to death. From a pure name recognition standpoint in his country, he probably would belong, but only for name recognition. Gama probably is an omission. So much of the turn of the century wrestling is based on myths, but certainly experts from that period always listed him as one of the greatest. I'm writing in regards to Mexico being underrepresented in the Hall of Fame. I believe Diablo Velasco, Black Shadow, Karloff Lagarde and Tarzan Lopez should be added. Black Shadow is the weirdest case since Rayo de Jalisco Sr. is in, and Rayo wasn't the draw or worker Shadow especially since he was a lazy drunk who did nothing after he became a main event guy. Rayo was a huge attraction, but it should be noted that El Santo and El Solitario were his regular tag team partners. Shadow was one of the two guys in what is still considered the most important match in the history of Lucha Libre, and is also credited with being the father of the high-flying style that Rayo Sr. and Solitario patterned their careers after. When he lost his mask, it was thought that his star power would fade, but then Lucha started to get on television and the cameras added a new dimension to his high-flying, and his main event career was extended a few more years. Lopez was the first serious money draw in Mexico, an excellent performer and the top man in Mexico until Santo and the generation of masked wrestlers took over, and even until his retirement he was considered a top guy. He was named Wrestler of the Year in Mexico 3 times. As for Lagarde, I don't know what reasons were stated for him not to be included. He became a big star at the same time Ray Mendoza did. He made tons of money as by the early 60s he was rich, had several properties, 3 or 4 cars and a petrol business. It is also said he was the best worker of the Mendoza and Lagarde and Rene Guajardo trio, even though he was a natural welterweight, so he usually looked small. Still, he was a main eventer in just about every arena he competed in. He was also a key player in the success of Guajardo, who was a second match wrestler until Lagarde took him under his ring and elevated him to main event status. He didn't get as much credit as Mendoza and Guajardo because he retired earlier and didn't have the huge money matches in the UWA during the early 80s that Mendoza and Guajardo had with Pero Aguayo, Abdullah the Butcher, Solitario, Fishman, Los Misioneros and the Japanese guys. Either way, his longevity as a main eventer and his credentials as a good worker make him a legitimate Mexican Hall of Famer. I would put him in long before even considering Alfonso Dantes. What about Francisco Flores? That's another obvious choice. Maybe even Huracan Ramirez, believe it or not, was a bigger star than Santo in some Latin American countries. Jose Fernandez. Ken Patero was a main event wrestler for 15 years. He was on top from the beginning of his career until well into the 80s. He headlined with Bruno Sammartino, Pedro Morales, Bob Backlund, Andre the Giant teamed with John Studd, headlined St. Louis, Madison Square Garden and every territory he appeared in. Why isn't he even on the radar screen? Despite having no wrestling background and starting his career at the age of 30, he learned how to work. He had a match with Bob Backlund that won Match of the Year, and a match with Backlund that was as good a scientific story match as I've seen. He headlined sold-out major arenas. Why doesn't that stuck up to Mick Foley, who really only had a relatively small run as a main event draw? Don Mattingly will never be considered for the Hall of Fame, and he dominated for 6 years due to his lack of longevity. Patero was a legitimate athlete who thrived as a worker and it easily puts him in the same class as many already in the Hall of Fame. Jeff Bookants. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,